Hi guys, it's time for another Wargames Soldiers and Strategy painting tutorial. And if you've been following this channel for the last several weeks, you know I've been focusing on sort of 20th century modern type figures because everybody has been wanting to see a lot of that. And I'm going to resume that next week, but for now I want to do a little something different because in case you haven't been, keeping up, a few days ago was Independence Day, July 4th in America, which, is a great big holiday for us where we celebrate breaking away from England, and, you can decide to classify that war however you like, but it is a big deal for us, and I'm American even though I don't actually live in America right now, so I couldn't kind of resist the opportunity to celebrate a little bit, and I'm going to be doing that by painting a appropriate figure, and this is the guy that I have picked out for that purpose. This is a line infantryman from the Continental Army. That's, the Americans, of course, not the British or the Loyalists, and he has a pretty standard uniform on that was worn by a lot of these guys, and there was variances in color and stuff depending on what state they came from, what unit precisely. And I haven't exactly figured out which that's going to be yet, but I will get to it as soon as the painting actually starts. I'll kind of make a decision on some of those details. This figure is, by the way, from Foundry, and it's very compatible with some other ranges. Perry is very famous, of course, for their AWI range, but Foundry has also some really nice figures, and I kind of like their slightly larger faces and larger scale, which is why I'm doing this guy. And he's been already base coated, of course, in gray enamel, and I have painted his hands and face in sort of the usual fashion. So that is what I am now going to be painting for you. This is a great tutorial for those people looking for more advice on white and buff, of course, and also, naturally, we're going to be painting some nice dark blue here. I don't think I've actually done all that much with dark blue, so this is a good opportunity if you want to know a little bit more about that. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so let's start out here by painting the pants. I told you in my introduction that I wasn't sure what unit I was going to pick, but I did say I wanted to show you a lot of white, buff, and blue. So after looking around a bit, I settled on the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment because it's a great combination of all those colors. And in this case, the pants are going to be buff. So I'm going to start out by applying a base coat of Foundry Buff Leather Medium. And now I'm going to apply a wash of Agrex Earthshade everywhere, but keep this light because you don't want it really overwhelming these pans because it's going to be a pretty light color that we're going for. Alright, now I'm going to start highlighting the pans, and I'm using Foundry Buff Leather Light for that. I've thinned it down quite a bit so I can get a nice transparent effect. And I'm going to apply it to most parts of the pants, sort of layering it on progressively. The only areas I'm really going to avoid are sort of down between his legs and maybe some creases sort of around his crotch area and that kind of thing. But for the most part, I'm going to be covering up especially any really dark brown areas that might be left now after the wash was applied in the last step. And now I'm going to move on to the second highlight layer in my pants, which is a mix of that buff leather light and a little bit of boneyard light. So you can see it's definitely a lighter color, though it's a fairly subtle difference. But you can see I'm using it here to pick out the tops of folds and creases, around the bottoms, anywhere where I want some extra light, the knees, all of those usual places. It's a fairly subtle highlight color, but I think it's still pretty clearly effective. And then my final highlight on the pants is going to be just pure boneyard light, and I'm going to apply this pretty sparingly because it's a very white color and I don't want my pants to get too washed out, too light. But you can see I'm using it around the bottoms of the pants, on the knees, and on the tops of the sharpest creases to give just a little bit of extra highlight and an extra bit of contrast. But yeah, once again, be careful with this. Don't go too far with it and blend it out a lot into your other colors. And then with the pants done, I'm going to move on to base coating all the sort of white-gray areas on the uniform. And in this case, that's going to include his waistcoat here, so the vest that he's wearing under his main jacket. All of his facings, the turnbacks on his coat, his cuffs, those are all also going to be white. Plus, of course, the big strap that he's got his ammunition bag attached to. All of that is going to be white on this particular uniform. So, as you can see, I'm just going in here and applying a base coat, and I'm using Arctic Gray Shade from Foundry to do this. But if you don't have Foundry, these are just pretty basic light gray colors, so you can very, very easily make them yourself just by mixing some black and white in to form, sort of a suitable lightish gray color. It's not something that you should get too hung up on. Next, I'm going to darken that gray-white a little bit using a very, very light wash of Nuln Oil. Keep it light because, as I said, this is white and it's really easy to go too far. And I'm going to be focusing specifically on the waistcoat and that area because there's a lot of creases and recesses there that you want to feel darker. I'm now going to apply the first highlight layer to all of the white areas, and for that I'm using Foundry Austrian Gray Light. But once again, as with the base color, this is a color you can very easily just make yourself by mixing a small amount of black into some white. You don't need the specific color. The main thing is it needs to be a very, very light gray. That's probably what you can see here. It's almost white, but not quite. And you can see now that I'm going to apply this very carefully because with these sort of waistcoats and cuffs and all that, there's lots of buttonholes and sort of detail areas where you really want to preserve all the shadows that you kind of got from the wash step. It's really important with these kinds of uniforms. So you need to be very, very careful when you're painting these sorts of things that you don't cover up that detail, that you're very careful with it. But you're going to want to apply, nonetheless, this sort of light gray color pretty much everywhere except those kinds of recesses and those edges. So we're really keeping that dark gray as sort of a defining line almost between sort of the white, light gray and everything else, and just letting it be a way of showing those details. And I'm applying this pretty heavily, probably, as you can tell. I'm not making any attempt to blend it out too much, though. A little bit on the waistcoat where I want it to appear like it gets darker right before it goes sort of underneath the jacket. You kind of want to use your own discretion here, basically. And then, as you might expect, the final highlight on these white parts of the uniform is going to be white. And once again, I have thinned it down a bit here just because the white that I have is a little thick and globby and it doesn't flow very well otherwise. And it also, making it a little transparent will also allow you to get a more depth of color, a little bit more range. You will end up applying a few more layers, but being able to build the white up gradually is very important with things like this so that it isn't just too starkly white, that you've got some slight differences in tone between the light gray and the white. And so you can see the white is mainly going on the areas where light would hit, and that's where I'm applying it strongest. So that's where I'm really going back over and over again and really applying multiple layers of it, because those are the areas that I want to feel the brightest, whereas areas sort of underneath the turnbacks and things like that and around sort of between around the edges under the vest, I'm trying to leave those more gray and really blend the white out into those areas so that it doesn't just look like it's just pure white without any sort of differentiation going on. And now to move on to the coat, which was really a nice deep blue color in this particular unit. And in fact, this deep blue was pretty consistently worn, especially later on all across the Continental Army, so you're going to see a lot. I've chosen for my blue a French blue, also from Foundry. I think that's a pretty good color, actually, French blue, because probably they would have been getting a lot of their fabric from the French. It would have been supplied to them, especially later on from there. So I think a French blue is a pretty good match. And so what I'm doing here is just carefully base coating all the blue areas of the jacket, which is basically all the areas I haven't painted already white, with the French blue shade color. And this is just very straightforward. Just be careful not to get any on the kind of areas that you've already painted. And then you're just going to want to move on, continuing with the French blue medium and applying that. I'm putting it most places except really the darkest recesses, which actually this figure has a lot of, like under the arm and under all of his bags and pouches. There's quite a few areas here actually that would be getting very little light, so that makes this step quite easy. You can see I'm mainly focusing on his back and on the tops of his sleeves and those kind of areas. Be careful, these jackets tend to have seams sculpted into them, especially on the back, so be careful to pick those out carefully. Don't paint over them with a lighter paint. Make sure you leave them nice and dark because that'll pay off later on. And then now, of course, for the French blue light, and I'm doing pretty much the same thing I did with the French blue medium, just applying it even more selectively and on the sort of top areas of the jacket and avoiding the seams, as I mentioned before, actually sort of trying to go down along the edges of the seams, in fact, and really picking out the folds and creases on the sleeves, because those are the areas of this uniform that are blue that you see the most, so that's where you should be really spending a lot of time getting good detail. And now I'm going to be adding one more highlight just because I think this is a very, very deep blue. There's not a lot of graduation between the three colors in the triad, so I want to get one more sort of high color on there, and I'm making that just by taking that French blue light and mixing some white into it. Not very much, because we don't want this to turn out pastel, just a little tiny bit to get a slightly lighter color, and I'm going to use that to really emphasize all the sharpest creases on his sleeves, and also to run sort of edge highlights down along those seams that I've been mentioning on his back, because picking out seams on a uniform is always a great detail that really makes it look like you know what you're doing, and like it sort of brings an extra professionalism to any models you're painting. So I really recommend trying to do that whenever you can. And next we're going to do the black and gray areas on the uniform. And I'm going to be doing these using Vallejo colors because I know I get some people finding it annoying that I use so much Foundry and the colors are kind of hard to find. So I want to try to incorporate more other paint ranges to help you out. So I'm going to start out with just some black paint. Actually, this could be from anybody, so this is easy. And I'm going to apply it to his shoes, his patch box that he's wearing, his hat, and I'm also going to apply it to a ribbon that he's got wrapped around his ponytail, and then also he's got a neck piece, sort of a neck stock too, or he can, and I'm going to be painting that black, so that's sort of a ring around his neck at the very top, and I'm going to be painting all of those areas black, and this is pretty straightforward. It's just you have to be careful of your previous paint work not to make a mess and get it where it doesn't belong. And now I'm going to start highlighting the black, and I'm going to be using a very, very simple technique for this. I'm going to be taking Vallejo German Gray, and I'm going to be mixing it into the black, and that's going to be my first highlight color. And that's going to go pretty much everywhere, and pretty much all the black areas. I'm going to apply it pretty generously. You can see I'm putting quite a bit on the hat. When you're painting these sort of tricorns, you can think about highlighting pretty much the entire back surface. And then on the front, where it sort of comes forward in a bulge, you want to focus extra highlights on that, and then on the side pieces, but those sort of areas in between should be darker in color. And then on the top, you want to leave most of that hat dark, all the recesses. You only probably want to put lighter paint on along the rim, and then on the ball or the bulge sort of in the middle. And then, of course, on the patch box, this would have been often sort of a shinier leather, so I tend to highlight it higher, but you just want to make sure you put a base everywhere. And on the shoes, same thing. Once I've applied that mix, I'm going to take pure German Gray and start applying that as a higher highlight, and it's really just continuing as before, just applying it at less places, but you can still be pretty generous with it because it's a very dark gray nonetheless. And then after that, it really turns into picking out the gray shades. And I'm just taking German Gray, and then going to be, I think I did 2 or 3 progressive highlights here where I mixed small amounts of white into my German Gray to get higher highlights. And the areas where I'm going to be emphasizing, start focusing on, especially as I go up in color, is sort of the edges of that patch box. As you can see, I'm really sort of building up color around the edges along that top line where you'd expect light to be hitting to get a little bit of shininess. But I'm trying to keep it subtle here because in the past sometimes I've gone too high with highlights on my black, but you can expect leather areas to be brighter than, say, the hat. So while the patch box and shoes can get higher highlights on areas where you expect light to be hitting, be careful with the hat. You don't want the gray to get too bright on that. So you know, you want the most emphasis sort of on the front, the sides, the top, and the edges, like I said, but don't go as light with your grays when you're painting those as you would, say, on the other areas. You can also go quite light on the ribbon wrapping around his ponytail in the back, because that would have been kind of a ribbon and probably kind of shiny, so you'd expect light to be hitting a lot, getting really bright, so that's fine. The only area you might think about applying a lighter gray to on his hat is going to be really the top edges and that kind of thing. But on the back and the front, be careful that you keep it really nice and subtle and don't go too high, because this would have been kind of wool felt, and you need it to look like that and not, you know, don't let it get too over the top, basically. And now I'm going to be moving on to the wooden areas, which include the stock of his rifle and also his water bottle, which was made of wood. It's sort of a barrel-like construction. I'm going to be using wood colors that I often use here, so I'm applying a base coat here of bay brown shade to all of those regions, and with the gun you've got to be a little careful not to make a mess because of the way he's holding it, but it shouldn't be too much trouble. Once that's done, I'm going to move on to highlighting. I'm going to be doing that with colors that I usually choose for wood, so I'm going to be starting out with chestnut shade, and I'm going to be applying that pretty liberally, especially on the gun stock, so I can get a really nice bright red. On that water bottle, you have to think of it as a barrel with stave construction, so try to pick out sort of the individual boards that go around the outside edge, and also try to put some sort of grain and streaking sort of inside that front area. You can do that a little bit too on the gun. That's fine when you're blending. Don't feel so much like you have to get a perfectly smooth blend. You can make your blend a little streaky and feathered, because that'll look nice and a little bit reflect sort of a wood grainy kind of effect on your gun. And you can see I'm going to just put this on fairly strongly on pretty much all the wood areas. After that, I'm going to take my chestnut medium, which is always sort of my high highlight on wood. I'm going to be using that then to especially pick out edges and edging and add that extra highlight to areas that I really want to define, like along the areas where the barrel of the gun joins with the metal and things like that. And on that stave drinking vessel, especially just on the edges of each of those planks, and some really high grain that I want to emphasize. Now I'm going to be doing the leather strap, which is holding on his water flask, and also be putting a little bit of extra highlight on his shoes, because even though they're black leather, I want to get a little brown worked into the highest highlights, because I think that just makes them a little bit more interesting, a little bit more attractive. So I've just taken that light gray that I used as the final highlight, mixed just a little tiny bit of that bay brown medium color into it, and I'm using that as a very light highlight. And then for the strap, I'm painting it like I always paint leather, and it's a very thin area, so this should be easy. So I'm applying first a base coat here of Vallejo German Camouflage Black Brown, and then I'm going to highlight first with a bay brown medium from Foundry, and then continue on with chestnut shade and chestnut medium. And those latter two colors, of course, need to be applied very lightly, very finely, mostly to the edges, but trying to really preserve some of that dark color underneath, because we do want to keep it looking different from the wood if at all possible. And now for his hair, and I usually don't show you how to paint hair, but I thought, well, why not? I'll do it this time. I'm going to be making his hair blonde too, which is also something I don't do very much on these guys, but I thought it might be a nice contrast and go with some of the buff colors that are already in the uniform. I'm applying here a base coat of that buff leather medium. I know it looks quite yellow here, but it actually does really come out this way. So that's going to be my base coat. And then after that, I'm going to be taking a wash of Agrax Earthshade so I can get sort of a darker color down in the recesses. And you can see too, I'm applying that Agrax Earthshade wash also to his water canteen, because I felt like there wasn't enough difference in color between the wood and the leather strap, so I wanted to really differentiate that, and the wash is a great sort of quick way to fix a problem like that, so I'm applying that there too. Remember, the blonde hair on most people is not like shockingly yellow or shockingly white. It's kind of unnatural looking. It's mostly more sort of a browny color, sort of a yellowish brown color on most people. So painting that sort of buff color makes sense, and then sort of washing it with brown. And the highlight I'm applying here is, believe it or not, the buff leather light color, and I'm just using it here to pick out some a few strands of hair and emphasize, the difference between the recesses and the strands that he's got. Now let's do the steel and silver areas of his uniform. I have made a base coat for those areas by mixing Vallejo Air gunmetal with some Vallejo German gray, and you want more German gray, obviously, a lot more than you want gunmetal for the base coat because we want it quite dark. So the areas you're going to be wanting to paint here are going to be the gun barrel, the flintlock on his rifle, of course, and then in this particular case, on this uniform, all of the buttons on his uniform. And you want to be especially careful in picking those out that you don't get sloppy and you keep them nice round circles. And I know that can be really tricky with a little brush to get nice little circles, so really take your time with that. Once I'm done, I'm going to be highlighting the areas of metal on the gun by just adding a bit more gunmetal into my initial mix to get it a little brighter for my sort of first highlight. And then I'm going to be taking a second highlight of just pure gunmetal, which I'm going to be applying quite lightly. Remember, as always, on gun parts, you don't want it to be quite so shiny as other areas, but you can go a little bit more because these older kinds of guns had sometimes more shiny parts than the modern guns tend to. With the buttons on his uniform, I am just going to be adding one highlight, and that's just going to be Vallejo Air Silver. So I'm just going to be putting that over the tops of the buttons, so you'll get a really strong contrast between that dark base coat and the silver highlight. And that's exactly what you want on these tiny areas, because there's really no point in applying any more subtlety on such small areas. And now finally for the bronze and gold areas. To do this, I've made a base coat by mixing Vallejo Air Gold with some Vallejo German Camouflage Black Brown. And you can see I'm applying it to all the gun hardware that I didn't already touch, like the trigger guard, sort of the hardware on his butt. There should also be gold or bronze around the top of the barrel. I'm also going to be applying it to the hooks that are holding his strap to his water bottle. That you could do this with something else. That could just as easily be steel. And also don't forget his belt buckles. You're going to have to be very careful with these because they're very fine and you need to pick this out without, messing up the work you've already done on the shoes. With that done, just go ahead and take the plain Vallejo Gold and just highlight all those areas. Just pick it out. And that's as much of a highlight as you really need, because these are not supposed to be really shiny, shiny gold. It's more like brass, bronze, and you don't want it to get too bright. Alright, so here's our soldier from the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment of the Continental Army around the time of the American Revolution. This would have actually probably been a little bit later on in the Revolution when their uniforms started to get a little bit more standardized. As I mentioned before, though, even though this is from that specific regiment, the colors and things in his uniform were very representative of a lot of regiments and units of that time. This blue, this white, this buff, that was getting used everywhere. So these should be techniques and colors you can apply all over the place, regardless of what unit you're working on. And remember that there was a lot of mixing and matching going on. There was not a great deal of standardization in these units always at that time, so people were wearing their own pants, their own waistcoats. So if you're going to paint a whole bunch of these guys, please feel free to mix in different colored elements, different types of pants and stuff, because people would have probably been doing that. The only thing that would have really been consistent, or most likely consistent, would have been the jackets, because that was the most important uniform element that people would have been wearing. But even then, that might have changed, because standardization, it was not very high at this point. And in fact, we don't even know for sure sometimes what some of these units were exactly wearing. We just have to make guesses. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, leave me your comments with what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want to see again, what you want to see less of, whatever you want to say. I'm interested in everything. Of course, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, so you can keep up with the latest news and updates and whatever else I'm working on. And I will be back next week with even more modern tutorials, because I know that's what is really popular and what is most useful to the most people. So until then, happy painting.